Empty Moral Space by Bluey. Peter thinks privately that Tuesdays really just suck. Sure, the universal fact that Tuesdays suck might possibly be due to the fact that he's been drugged, kidnapped, and tied to a chair in the most cliché warehouse ever. However, his awful day started out several hours before, with an alarm clock that didn't go off on time, a coffee stain on his brand new shirt, and an English lit test during first period. Not that he even made it to first period, because apparently his kidnappers took the early morning shift instead of the late night one. Honestly though, if he has to choose between being kidnapped and taking that English lit test, he isn't quite sure that he'd pick the test. Being kidnapped isn't so bad either. With the drugs almost out of his system, he gets to sit in a chair and watch as his 4 kidnappers bumble around their secret warehouse. There's 2 men and 2 women, perfectly even for diversity purposes, Peter assumes. Dressed in black ski masks, black pants, and black shirts. They shift around in the relative darkness of the warehouse, since the only light through the sky-high windows is near the ceiling of the building. Every once in a while, Peter will hear a curse or a panicked whisper from one kidnapper, as they try to desperately set up whatever they're setting up. It's basically free entertainment. Distantly, he's aware that he should probably be a little bit more suspicious of why they kidnapped him, of all people. But logic works its way through his brain, and he knows that there are a multitude of reasons why someone would go after him. It's obviously not a Spider-Man reason. He can tell that just by the rope instead of vibranium around his wrists. That typically leaves the whole Tony Stark intern reason, which isn't common knowledge exactly, but definitely not hidden if someone wants to do a little digging. Peter has to put something on his college resume after all. His kidnappers are all more than a little frustrated, if the muffled curse words and low bickering are anything to go by. They don't seem to take notice of him either, which is really just bad etiquette at this point. They're messing with something tech-based. A camera? Or perhaps a phone, at their lone desk a couple feet away from where Peter sits, alone, in the middle of absolutely nothing but dust bunnies and old wrappers. Obviously, interior design is not a concern when it comes to warehouse decorations. "I thought you said this would work," one of them hisses, loud enough that his voice bounces off the walls. "You should probably film a kidnapping video if you want to seem professional," Peter offers, helpfully, but Peter's never kidnapped someone, so he can't really be considered the expert here. All 4 of them snap their heads in his direction. The woman on the left, tall, broad, and in high heels of all things, has her mouth open in shock. The man holding the tech, which is a phone, is rather short, sandy blonde hair and the obvious black ski mask that comes up to his nose. There's the other 2, one short-haired woman and the other tall, buff guy with a bat. They vary in their levels of surprise, but it seems that none of them accounted for Peter's super metabolism getting rid of the drugs faster than it should. "Hey," Peter says. "What the fuck?" High-heeled woman starts, then turns and snaps. "Why is the kid awake? Josie, I thought I said give him enough to take him out for another couple hours." "I did," Josie hollers right back. "That's really unfortunate," Peter tells her, just because he can. Also, because if they had to ruin his day, then he might as well have some fun before he completely demolishes theirs. High Heels doesn't seem to like that very much, and marches right up to grab his face. She leans in really close. Too close, actually, because Peter knows she has not brushed her teeth recently by the way they smell, and forces him to look upwards. Peter hopes she sees how apathetic he's feeling right now. "So this is Tony Stark's intern," she muses, eyebrow raised like she isn't impressed. Tough crowd. She lets go of his face. Peter stretches his jaws where her nails dug in. "Whatever. You were gonna sit here, shut up, and look pretty until we get everything ready." "Sure," Peter agrees easily, because he's fantastic at sitting and looking pretty. Like, truthfully talented. His tone surprises her enough that she pauses, before shaking her head and yelling, "Derek! Is the phone ready yet?" Derek, the short guy with the phone, yells back, Almost. Well, hurry the fuck up! Shouldn't you have this pre-prepared before the kidnapping victim gets here? Peter asks, because he's never really been good at the whole shut up part. High Heels turns to glare at him. She grabs his face again and shakes it around. Peter has to stop himself before he bites her fingers. I told you to shut up, she hisses. Derek! It's ready! High Heels gives him a particularly vindictive smile as she snakes around his chair and yanks the back of it so she's dragging Peter across the floor. The scraping sound grates on his sensitive ears, and Peter tries to not be annoyed, but really, why not position the chair closer to the desk if she's just going to drag him over anyways? If it's for dramatic effect, well, Peter can't say he's intimidated. It must show on his face, because tall buff dude asks, shouldn't you be screaming in terror? Peter gives him the most incredulous look he can muster. You took me away from my English lit test. If anything, I should be thanking you. The fuck is this kid? Derek is eyeing him, more than a little confused. If Derek didn't willingly kidnap 16-year-olds, Peter might have more sympathy. Josie won't meet his eyes. High Heels rattles his chair aggressively from behind him. Tall buff dude snorts. At least someone here has a sense of humor. Enough of this! High Heels snaps. She must be the leader or something, because the other three seem to stop what they're doing and listen. She pokes Peter in the chest. You are gonna call Tony Stark. Isn't he gonna track the phone? Peter interrupts. Because what kind of plan involves calling Tony Stark? Why would you want to call Iron Man? He's a tech genius. An actual superhero. You do realize he makes a living by killing people, right? He can't track that phone, High Heels says. Can he, though? Peter says offhandedly. I mean, he is Tony Stark. High Heels looks unsure enough to glance at Derek, but Derek only shakes his head. She narrows her eyes and continues, as if Peter hadn't interrupted. You're Tony Stark's intern, so you're the one that's going to call Tony Stark. Why do you even want Mr. Stark? Peter complains. Because if he's going to be tied in a chair, then these assholes are going to hear about it. Money? Glory? Any specific goals besides pissing off the man in a weaponized suit of armor? We don't want Tony Stark, Josie snorts, like Peter made a joke. Peter thinks she's an asshole. It's High Heels that answers in that smug way that all villains do. Head high, slight smirk, and cocky tone. Her eyes flicker in the dimly lit room, and she says, slowly, we only want Spider-Man. Oh. Huh. That's new. You have gotta be kidding me, says Peter Parker, who conveniently happens to be Spider-Man, unbeknownst to his kidnappers. They must take his surprise for terror. Josie actually looks at him with a smirk when she says, we're not. Peter goes through all the 5 stages of grief and the time it takes for him to process the fact that they unknowingly kidnapped Spider-Man while trying to get to Spider-Man. His life has officially crossed the border from unusual to downright weird, as if being bitten by a radioactive spider and becoming a teenage vigilante and hanging out with the Tony Stark isn't already a trip and a half on the abnormal scale. Derek punches in a number. Peter can hear it dialing even before he puts it on speaker near Peter's face. He almost hopes that Mr. Stark doesn't answer at all, because wouldn't that be an ego boost? As per Parker luck, Mr. Stark does pick up. Who is this and how'd you get this number? Mr. Stark's voice comes through the line. He sounds more than a little exhausted and rightfully pissed off. I'm in a rather important, albeit stressful meeting right now, so if this can wait... He cannot wait, tall buff dude says. Derek smacks Peter on the side of the head and makes the universal start talking motion with his hands. Talk. Ow! Hey! Peter tries not to roll his eyes, but starts talking anyway. Mr. Stark, So, funny story, I actually got kidnapped. I mean, I was just minding my own business, right? I had that English test, the one I was telling you about yesterday. Remember when we were in your lab? I think I remember mentioning it, but I'm not sure. Peter, Mr. Stark tries. He sounds surprised, so that's pretty neat. Peter hasn't managed to surprise Mr. Stark in a while. Peter continues on. Anyways, my alarm didn't go off, so I was late leaving the door, and I was already kind of stressed about the entire thing, you know? I was almost late for class, and still really, really far, so I was speed walking to school, like a normal kid, not at all taking the fast way, because I know you got mad last time when I did that. I'm still trying to go over the English test stuff in my head, because I did not study for the test at all, so I'm not exactly paying attention when... High Heels must have had enough of his talking, which... rude. Because she snatches the phone from his face. Bring Spider-Man to us, High Heels says, and rattles off an address. If that bug isn't here in the next 24 hours, then the intern gets it. We're not going to ask a second time. There's a pause. Then, you want Spider-Man? In exchange for your intern, High Heels affirms. Spider-Man. Mr. Stark repeats. Peter thinks he sounds more amused than worried for Peter's apparent safety. 24 hours, Stark, High Heels says. Spider-Man is not an easy person to get in contact with, so I would hurry. Peter bites his lip hard enough to leave a mark in order to keep his big mouth shut. You interrupted my meeting, kidnapped my intern, and are demanding I hand you Spider-Man? Is this a joke? Mr. Stark actually laughs this time. This is not a joke, Stark, High Heels tries. But Mr. Stark is a man on a mission, and no one is going to stop him when he gets going. This is ridiculous, Mr. Stark snorts. He does seem rather serious when he says, Peter, I'm going to come get you, so just stay. High Heels makes the cut motion with her hands. Derek goes to hang up the phone. Peter has just enough time to shout, It's all cool, I've got this, bye! The phone goes silent. There's a good 10 seconds of silence from everyone in the room. So I think that went well, Peter says. High Heels turns to him furiously. She grabs his face, again, and sneers. You had one job, brat. Peter thinks he did a pretty good job, considering, so he sticks his tongue out at her. She smacks his face like an asshole. It's not his fault that all the directions they gave him were, call Mr. Stark. It's not like they said beg for your life or bargain for your safety. Besides, Peter has never really been the begging type of person. He's definitely not the type of person to sit around and wait to be rescued, unfortunately for these baddies. With Mr. Stark hunting him down, he's now on a time crunch. You know people who call and threaten Mr. Stark always lose, right? Peter says, as he flexes his wrists and feels the rope stretch under his strength. He conveniently leaves out that Iron Man is not the person that they need to worry about the most. That's a thing that happens. He's never met us before, Josie says, like a stereotypical villain. That is so obnoxiously cliché, he tells her. Of course, it's High Heels who gets annoyed first. She turns to give tall buff dude a pointed look, and says, Put his chair back. Put his chair back means dragging him back to his lonesome spot in the center of the warehouse. Peter thinks it's because it's far enough out of hearing range for a normal person. They'll just leave him alone to congregate by the desk. To add on to their bad luck, they don't take Peter's enhanced hearing into consideration. So Peter's privileged enough to hear all about their whispered plans, information, and other drama that goes on when you kidnap a 16-year-old off the street in broad daylight. Peter's not sure how much time passes while he sits in silence. It's not like he's got a clock or anything. But he is aware of how boring it is. It's almost enough to make him wish he's taking that English lit test, because at least he'd be able to do something. Peter knows Mr. Stark is on his way. He's not worried in that aspect, but he's also not really prepared for the mortal embarrassment that he's going to feel when Mr. Stark flies through the warehouse like a knight in shining Iron Man armor. He could just break the ropes and kick ass, but that runs the very high risk of outing his identity to a bunch of criminals for the second time. Ugh. Stupid secret identities. Stupid kidnappers. So, why Spider-Man? Peter calls out from his spot in the chair. If he's stuck debating whether or not he wants to break out, he might as well make some sort of conversation. New York is full of vigilantes and heroes. I hear Daredevil is pretty easy to contact if you know the right people. Deadpool's probably in the area. You could have just gone for Mr. Stark directly. That's none of your business, Josie says. It kinda is Peter's business, but he's not going to be the one that says that. All you need to know is when we get him, we are going to squish him like a bug, Derek says, and laughs. Peter stares at the ceiling and imagines that he's currently taking his English Lit test. The bug joke is so old, you guys. It's so old, Peter says, as if he hasn't been called a bug for the last 2 years. Just to be inconspicuous, he tacks on, he's a spider. Spiders are bugs, says Josie, who has obviously never taken a basic entomology class. They are not. Insects, then, tall buff dude says. They're not, Peter huffs. They're arachnids. You can squish both, High Heel says, making it sound like the end of a conversation. Peter's not done, however, because he spent most of his free time researching spiders, and he knows when he's right. Hours and hours of research, in fact. He's made a game of reading as many articles, papers, and undergrad or graduate thesis that he can get his hands on. If Mr. Stark noticed the changes made to his card for spider-related paywalls, he's never mentioned it. Have you ever seen a bird-eater in person? Peter asks with a challenge in his voice. A giant huntsman? Hercules baboon spider? They're like a little too big for you lot to just smash with your feet. Then we'll use a gun, Josie snaps. Just like with Spider-Man. Peter wrinkles his nose. You can't squash something with a gun. Can you please shut him up? High Heel says, sounding more than a little exasperated. Peter sticks his tongue out at her when her back is turned. Knock him out or something. Please, Peter says. A nap would be nice right about now. Derek stares at him. Peter winks. Derek leans just a bit further away and says, Literally, what the fuck is with this kid? Shut him up! High Heel screeches. They must be at the end of their string of patience, because tall buff dude comes at him with a bat. And yeah, Peter decides that he really doesn't want to heal from a concussion tomorrow. Kidnapping has been fun and all, but Peter has homework and an aunt to worry about, so he really doesn't have time to stay and chat with a group of arseholes. He thinks that a kid breaking rope with his bare hands might be a little suspicious, but if he can play it right, he might just be able to get out of here with his identity intact. He'll just be remembered as that 16-year-old who can secretly throw hands pretty damn well. If 10-year-old Kevin McAllister can send a bunch of baddies running, then there's no reason that a 16-year-old Peter Parker can't do the same. New Yorkers have always been made of some tough shit. If that doesn't work out, then Peter's plan B includes hitting them really, really hard, and hope that they forget everything that happened in the first place. He snaps the ropes behind his back just in time to catch the bat hurtling towards his face. Tall buff dude is so surprised that he hesitates for just a second. Peter takes that second to wrench the bat out of his hands and throw the handle into his stomach. He's down on his knees and out before the other three even realize what was happening. High Heel stares at him. Derek drops his phone. Josie actually has an emotional expression on her face. Peter holds out a bat with a friendly smile. I think you dropped this. High Heels is so mad that she pulls a gun out of her clothes with an angry screech. Derek takes a nosedive towards the computer, and Josie eases back to grab another firearm from the desk. Peter's spidey sense screams in the back of his mind. He has just enough time to duck out of the way and into the shadows of the warehouse before they start shooting at him. Bullets rain past. Several hit the walls and ricochet around him. Some splinter on impact. High Heels is screeching like an owl with how mad she is. Peter speeds around the edge of the warehouse and just generally tries not to be shot. He's covered by the darkness enough that they technically can't see that he's dodging most of them. Thank you, Spidey Sense. Sometimes you are more than just weaponized anxiety. Shooting at people is rude, Peter snaps. He sneaks out, snatches what remains of his kidnapped chair before throwing it hard enough to knock High Heels off balance. He's on her before she can recover, throwing her to the ground and out of the way. She skids for a few feet, puffing. Peter uses the time to snatch Josie's gun from her hands and flip the desk so it lands squarely on Derek's back. Their guns skid out of their hands and go clattering to the other side of the building. Derek squirms but is unable to move. Josie holds up her hand looking mildly terrified and says, I didn't know we were dealing with James Bond. Jesus fucking Christ, don't kill me. What the hell does Stark feed his interns? Derek wheezes from under the desk. Peter crosses his arms over his chest, raises his eyebrows, and gives them the most disappointed look he can muster. Don't kidnap people. It's tactless. Please get this desk off me. Derek sounds actually pained. You deserve that, Peter tells him. Then he knocks Josie and Derek out in just enough time to catch the fist that High Heels has aimed at the back of his head. It's sloppy at best, and Peter has no problem throwing her over his shoulder. You! He hisses, sounding enraged, but she's the one who kidnapped him, so really, who's at fault here? Can we not do this? Peter says. She doesn't listen. When she lunges again, Peter takes the time to slip under and elbow her in the stomach. She goes down, hard, and luckily for Peter, she doesn't look like she's going to be moving anytime soon. The fight doesn't even last 5 minutes. The worst Peter got out of it was some dust on his brand new jeans that he and Aunt May got on their last shopping trip. There's an exit door in the corner. Peter starts walking towards it when a thought occurs to him. He stops, the feeling of defeat pulling in his stomach, because he distinctly remembers that he has absolutely no idea where he is. When he opens the door, he is not, in fact, surrounded by the skyscrapers of New York City, but instead thousands and thousands of trees. Peter is in the middle of absolutely nowhere, with nowhere to get home. Well, fuck, Peter says, to the 4 unconscious people in an empty warehouse. Peter decides eventually that waiting to be rescued might be his best bet. He wanders around the outside of the warehouse for a while, walking in circles just to keep himself busy. He makes sure that criminals 1 through 4 are safe, securely tied up, and definitely not about to wake up anytime soon. For a while, he lounges on the grass outside and counts the number of clouds. He tries to use the phone to call Mr. Stark again, but had been broken in the shooting, which, in Peter's opinion, is pretty standard luck. There's a point that Peter wished he was taking that English test. That point is the lowest Peter has ever been as a person, second only to the time when he ordered 10 Big Macs from Uber Eats instead of walking down 2 blocks to pick it up himself. It's about 4 hours in when Peter, having nothing better to do than nap against the doors of the warehouse, hears the distinct sounds of Iron Man's repulsors from above him. Mr. Stark lands not 10 feet from him and steps out of his suit when Peter finally opens his eyes and blinks languidly. Peter gets to his feet and stretches his arms over his head with a casual, "Hey, Mr. Stark." "You couldn't have waited at all?" Mr. Stark says. He sounds amused, even though he knows Mr. Stark is doing that weird worried parent once-over that all adults seem to do after he takes names and kicks ass. It's cool and all to be picked up by Mr. Stark, mostly because Peter doesn't really want to walk back to NYC on foot. His driver's license is still a work in progress, but, well, he lives in New York City and he's Spider-Man. There's really no need for a hurry, he can get around just fine. He stops, though, because during his fixation on Mr. Stark, he failed to realize that Mr. Stark brought company. He stares at the Avengers, Rogue and all. The Avengers, Rogue and all, stare right back. Mr. Stark doesn't seem to be very inclined to fight them, so Peter assumes there's some Avenger resolutions he's missed in the past few hours he'd been gone. Peter looks at Mr. Stark. If I had known you were making this an Avengers field trip, I would have made myself more presentable. Holy shit, that's Captain America! Actual Steve Rogers stands before Peter Parker. Not in an airport in Germany, but in the middle of bumfuck New York, dressed in nothing more than a faded t-shirt and jeans. He looks different than before, beard and all, but Peter's looked at his Captain America trading cards enough to know to recognize him on sight. Captain America looks more than a little confused, and rather overwhelmed for a guy that was supposed to be pretty unshakable. Peter. Mr. Stark tries to rein him in. But Peter's got a one-track mind, and right now that mind is set on Captain America mode. Peter reaches out to shake Mr. America's hand. Mr. America accepts, but the confused expression on his face is about as readable as a children's book. Mr. Falcon looks like he might just pass out from repressed laughter. Wow, sir, I'm a huge fan, really. Peter. Mr. Stark tries again. Peter lets go of actual Captain America's hand, and backs off to stand next to Mr. Stark. Steve Rogers, Natasha Romanoff, and Sam Wilson stand across to them, looking both amused and confused at the same time. What are you all even doing here? Peter asks, and shifts his weight to the balls of his feet and back to his heels. You know, war criminals and all. He glances at Mr. Stark, who's a little tense but doesn't look like he's about to create Berlin 2.0 again. Peter knows there's some bad blood there. Most of the world at this point knows of Mr. Stark and Mr. Rogers' disagreement. Peter had a little post-airport Googling session on the Accords, but what happened during the split seems a little more personal. Peter's never really been the one to poke his head into nasty personal problems, so he never really got a chance to ask. Stark, Mr. Rogers says, and he's a little quiet. Peter wonders how much Mr. Stark told him about the entire situation, and about him especially. If the looks he's currently getting are anything to go by, Peter assumes the answer is not much. What exactly is going on? Mr. Stark sighs and pushes Peter forward. Hi, Peter says. I'm Peter. Sam Wilson looks at him like he's grown a second head. I thought you were kidnapped. That was almost a dad joke, Peter informs him brightly. Mr. Wilson looks like he can't decide between laughing and throwing Peter out of a window. Kidnappers didn't really do a good job of kidnapping. They're inside. Are you hurt? Mr. Stark asks, and janks him back a little bit. Peter stumbles, but Mr. Stark catches him by the shoulders and does another one of his once-overs. Peter tries not to roll his eyes because he's fine, really. Mr. Stark comes to the same conclusion if the small teasing smile on his face is anything to go by. When Peter is deemed, in fact, A-OK, he says, They really kidnapped you to get to Spider-Man? Peter grins. Isn't that funny? I'm missing something here, I think, Mr. Wilson says. Miss Romanoff is watching the two of them, eyebrows raised like she knows exactly what's going on here. She probably does. Super spies are intimidating like that. Whatever, I was planning on doing this anyway, Mr. Stark says, and pushes Peter forward a little bit. Seeing the nod on Peter's face, Mr. Stark plows on. Team, meet Spider-Man. Spider-Man, meet team. Hi, Peter says. There's silence for all of 5 seconds. Mr. Wilson looks like he's about to have an aneurysm, but Miss Romanoff and Mr. Rogers seem incredibly composed. Peter wishes he had that kind of unshakable vibe. Mr. Stark must have seen something on their faces, because he sighs and makes a get-on-with-it gesture with his hands. All right, get it out of your system so I don't have to deal with this on the ride back. You're letting a child on the Avengers, Mr. Romanoff says smoothly. Peter almost sticks her tongue out at her, like an adult, but her tone isn't mocking exactly. More curious than accusing. Please, Mr. Stark says. Please try and stop him. I've tried, his aunt has tried, we have all tried. Mr. Stark actually sounds exhausted, and Peter knows he's the sole reason for that, so he flip-flops between feeling amused and guilty. I'm more like a junior varsity Avenger anyway, Peter says. I've got things to do, you know. Old ladies that need help crossing the street, grand theft bicycle, a mugging or two if I'm lucky. His Weenie Hut Junior's ticket hasn't expired yet, Mr. Stark confirms, which is just a really crass way of saying that Peter's actually 10 years old. He's younger than Wanda. I don't know if this is the best idea, Mr. Wilson says slowly. He really seems like he's the only one worried about an actual 16-year-old swinging around New York in brightly colored spandex with a spider theme. He can stick to walls and bench press a truck, Mr. Stark says, as a way of defense. Peter throws out a peace sign when they all turn to look at him. Any more concerns? There are no more voiced concerns. Any hidden comments, Rogers? Mr. Stark says, but there's an edge to his voice. Peter glances at Mr. Stark, then at Mr. Rogers, and quickly decides that he is not, in fact, going to be wrapped up in this bullshit anytime soon. They can sort their own problems out like adults. Peter has homework to do, and kidnappers to avoid. When I was around his age, I faked my registration papers and enlisted in a war, then agreed to be experimented on in order to create the perfect soldier, Mr. Rogers, aka Actual Captain America, says. It would be hypocritical of me to say anything about Peter's situation. Mr. Stark seems satisfied with this answer at least. Mr. Wilson certainly is not, and tries to rip a new one then and there, but no one seems to be listening to him. Peter thinks he's secretly bitter that he got his arse handed to him by a 16-year-old rookie in Berlin, but he doesn't seem to voice his thoughts for fear of a lecture. Instead, he turns to Captain America. I would die for you, Peter informs him. Please don't, Mr. Rogers says. Miss Romanoff hides a smile by looking in the other direction. For a spy, she really isn't fantastic at hiding how funny she finds this entire situation. That's slang, Rogers, Mr. Stark says, even though Peter is dead serious. He'd die for Mr. Stark too, but doesn't voice that thought because Mr. Stark is finally starting to relax a bit, and Peter has been known to bring a sort of structured chaos into his life when least expected. Now that this mess is all figured out, Underoos, you ready to head back? My aunt is gonna kill me, Peter tells him, in lieu of an actual response. He's dying to get back to the city. He's never been one for trees and nature and kidnappings. Ned, predictably, is going to flip when Peter tells him. Peter's English teacher is going to, predictably, flip for an entirely different and much less fun reason. Oh, absolutely, Mr. Stark says. She's already left me 16 angry voicemails. My aunt is going to kill you, Peter amends. Mr. Stark nods, like he's already accepted his fate. Spangles, Birdie, Widow, Mr. Stark says. You coming or not? We still have a meeting to finish. Accords to amend and Avenger business to settle. Ross's ass to kick, Mr. Wilson adds. Ross's ass to kick, Mr. Stark agrees. That's where Peter finds himself, exactly 7 hours after his initial kidnapping, on a Quinjet, surrounded by people he's looked up to for his entire life. It's a little awkward. A little weird, but Peter finds he's not uncomfortable with any of them. Even Mr. Wilson, who hasn't stopped shooting him looks since he first introduced himself as Spider-Man. Mr. Stark, while tense, doesn't seem particularly malicious when he teases the others, and no one tries to stab Mr. Stark when he isn't looking, so Peter has some hope for the future of the Avengers. There's a long way to go and a lot of stuff to be talked over, but it's a start. It's fine, truthfully, because starting is always the hardest part. Peter is pretty damn confident that they can figure out the rest.